and you're very welcome this morning to the second meeting of our special interest group. I'd like to welcome members of the Evolution and Psychiatry Special Interest Group and also members of the Eating Disorders Special Interest Group with the College of Psychiatrists of Ireland. I'd like to thank the College of Psychiatrists of Ireland and in particular Helen Murray for organising today's event and for supporting our initiative in recent months. And of course, I'd like to give a special welcome and thanks to our guest speaker today, Dr Riadh Abed from the UK. The main focus of the meeting this morning is on Riadh's presentation, and we will also have time at the end for a brief business meeting. I'd like to thank as well those who have contributed to this group in recent months, to email discussions and to our very active WhatsApp group. And I'd also like to thank international colleagues who may be watching or will be able to see recordings of this meeting, especially Riadh again, Dr. Derek Tracy and Adam Hunt in the United Kingdom, and of course Randolph Messi in the United States. All of these individuals and others have been very supportive of our initiative. So moving on to Riadh then for this morning. Riadh qualified in 1974 in Baghdad, and then he trained in the United Kingdom from 1979 onwards. He worked as a consultant psychiatrist in the NHS and honorary senior lecturer with the University of Sheffield for 25 years, retiring in 2012, with the last 7 years as medical director of a mental health trust in South Yorkshire. Riadh is currently a medical member of the mental health tribunals in England, and Riadh has had an interest in the application of evolutionary theory to the understanding of mental disorders since the mid-90s. And he has published novel evolutionary theories on eating disorders, OCD, and schizophrenia, as well as research findings, review articles, and chapters on evolutionary psychiatry subjects. Riadh has really been the leading light in the United Kingdom in evolutionary psychiatry, and he was instrumental in the formation of the Evolutionary Psychiatry Special Interest Group with the Royal College of Psychiatrists in 2016, in collaboration with colleagues in the UK, and Riadh was its founding chair from 2016 until 2020. He's currently the finance officer with the Special Interest Group. Riadh has also been secretary of the section of evolutionary psychiatry at the World Psychiatric Association from 2013 to the present. So that's just a brief bio on Riadh, but I've also gone through the, I suppose, arc of publications and writing and research that Riadh has done over the years. And going back to 1998, Riadh had published a paper entitled OCD, a Psychological Immune System, which had very much an evolutionary perspective. In 2004, Riadh published on offspring in women and suicide risk, which again had an evolutionary perspective. And then in 2005, Riadh published his first paper, as far as I can see, on eating disorders from an evolutionary perspective, where he looked at female intrasexual competition. I'm sure that's a topic he will be covering in today's talk. In 2008, Riadh had a publication in the British Journal of Psychiatry marking the 150th anniversary of On the Origin of Species. And then in 2011, Riadh jumped into schizophrenia and wrote about outgroup intolerance in the etiology of that condition. He had further publications in 2012, 2016, and 2018 on intersexual competition in eating disorders, and he researched both student populations and clinical populations of people with eating disorders in this research. 2016, he had the formation of the Special Interest Group and wrote about this in the literature. And then in 2019, he reached into the area of evolutionary biology and its application to psychiatric training and education. He's also written other general articles on evolutionary psychiatry in the international literature. One paper in particular is very important to me, which is a 2000 publication in the British Journal of Psychiatry. And the title of this was Psychiatry and Darwinism, Time to Reconsider. And that for me came at a very good time. It was just a year or two after I had first become aware of the topic, and seeing Riadh's article in the British Journal was a real bonus for me. It's a very well written article, very accessible, and sets out the key principles of evolutionary psychiatry very well. And it's an article I've read and reread several times over the years. In terms of textbooks, Riadh has also contributed numerous chapters and is working on a textbook at the moment. The most recent chapter I have to hand is the chapter that Riadh has written with Paul St. John Smith in the Sage Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology. And it's an absolutely fantastic resource for all of the key clinical diagnostic categories and the evolutionary perspectives involved. There's also, of course, the Evolutionary Psychiatry Special Interest Group newsletter, which comes out every 3 months, and there's high quality articles in every issue of that. So I'd advise our Irish members to join up as members of the Royal College Group if you're not already members, so you can have access to that newsletter as well. So in summary, I think if you were to go back over the publication list for Riadh, it's really a wonderful overview of evolutionary psychiatry over 20 years or more. And I'd advise that you have a look at the record of his publications. And then finally, I'd just like to again welcome Riadh and thank him for joining us today. Céad Míle Fáilte, which is 100,000 welcomes, Riadh, to you in Irish. And it's a virtual welcome, but welcome nonetheless. So I'll hand over to Riadh now.
Okay, well, thanks again, Henry, for inviting me to speak at your meeting. I'm hoping that our two EPSIGs in the UK and Ireland will collaborate on future activities and events to promote evolution among psychiatrists and doctors generally, and to bring evolution increasingly into the mainstream. So just to give a plug for a couple of forthcoming events by EPSIG UK, we're holding our AGM virtually on the 11th of June. This will be followed by a webinar lecture with a guest speaker on the subject of social determinants of health. The guest speaker is an evolutionary behavioral scientist, Gillian Pepper from Newcastle. All are welcome. Unfortunately, there will be a small registration fee to pay because we have to comply with the Royal College rules, new rules on meetings and conferences. On the 29th of October, we will be holding our whole day 4th International Evolutionary Psychiatry Symposium with 6 keynote speakers from around the world, all renowned evolutionists. The format of that meeting is still not fully sorted out. We have to comply with the extant rules regarding the pandemic. So it might be virtual or face-to-face or a hybrid. Finally, just to mention that those of you interested in evolution may be interested in our forthcoming edited volume on evolutionary psychiatry to be published jointly by the Royal College of Psychiatrists and Cambridge University Press with contributions leading and that will hopefully be coming out in 2022. So my talk today is about applying evolutionary principles to the understanding of eating disorders. And for all practical purposes, eating disorders will refer to anorexia and bulimia nervosa unless otherwise stated. So in my view, there are a number of reasons why eating disorders may be the ideal case study for the application of evolutionary principles to the understanding of disease and disorder in humans generally. And I'll be expanding on this idea during my talk, and we might touch upon it further in the Q&A. So what I will be telling you, of course, is my take on the evolutionary roots of eating disorder, which is an area of literature with a diversity of ideas, sometimes conflicting with each other. But that's a good thing, in my view, because evolutionary psychiatry is a scientific discipline, and the final arbiter for what should remain part of our thinking and what should be discarded or reformulated should be empirical findings and data. So I accept that some of what I'm going to say is open to challenge, and some of what I'm going to say will be refuted. And that's also a good thing, because that's how science progresses. So one more thing to say about evolutionary theories is just to remind ourselves that evolutionary theories of disorder are theories of ultimate causation that answer the why question rather than the how. And this is following on from the thinking and the framework set by leading evolutionists such as Ernest Mayr and Nicholas Tinbergen. However, theories of ultimate and proximate causation are not mutually exclusive. They can apply simultaneously, and therefore many of the evolutionary theories I'll be mentioning in my talk will be compatible to a whole range of proximate causes. So now the slide isn't changed. Okay, slide has changed now. So this is an outline of what I'm going to be covering in my presentation. I'll just say a few words about epidemiology and core clinical features of anorexia and bulimia. I'll then briefly survey evolutionary thinking on eating disorders. I will then briefly discuss some pertinent or relevant evolutionary themes to the causation of eating disorders. Then I will discuss my own hypothesis, which is the sexual competition hypothesis, and briefly review some of the studies around it, and also the recent theoretical extensions of the sexual competition hypothesis by others. And I will finish by saying something about the utility of evolutionary thinking in eating disorders. So this is some of the epidemiology. Now, I'm not going to be discussing, I'm assuming that everyone is aware of the diagnostic criteria of anorexia and bulimia in current classification and diagnostic systems of DSM and ICD. I just want to draw attention to the core features that that are common to anorexia, bulimia, and subclinical forms of eating disorders. And these are the drive for thinness, the fear of fatness, and behaviors aimed at altering or reducing weight and altering shape. Okay, these are the common features that that will, in my view, demand an evolutionary explanation. Also, the female preponderance of eating disorders is an important feature. It used to be received wisdom that the female to male ratio was in the region of around 10:1. Recent studies have reduced this down to somewhere between 3 or 4:1 in favor of females. Nevertheless, as far as I can tell, those presenting for treatment are still overwhelmingly female. There are a whole range of studies of prevalence of anorexia and bulimia in the literature, mostly conducted in Western populations, and these are the kind of figures that you get. Bulimia is found to be more common in population studies than anorexia, and some claim it's around 3 times or more as common as anorexia nervosa. One of the important concerns about eating disorder is their high mortality risk. This applies particularly to anorexia nervosa, who is, that is the most lethal of all psychiatric disorder, with a crude mortality rate of 5.6% per decade and overall mortality of some 10%, with an increase in suicide risk. Also, eating disorders show a peak at puberty in females, but not males, and the peak age of onset for anorexia nervosa is between 16 and 18. So these are the characteristics that of eating disorders that make them of particular interest to evolutionists. The first is that they claim that eating disorders are novel disorders that have emerged in recent times. Also, that all eating disorders are more prevalent in Western and Westernized societies. The evidence also points to a significant increase in all variants of eating disorders in recent decades in Western countries. And of course, Gerald Russell, who maintained this, also described, as you will know, bulimia nervosa for the first time as a novel disorder. He described that in a published paper in 1979, and always maintained that this was a new variant of eating disorder that never existed before the second half of the 20th century. So, there is also now a claim that the increase in eating disorders now spreading to developing countries in association with industrialization, urbanization, and westernization. And I would suggest that all of these features should ring some alarm bells in the minds of evolutionists to suggest to them that an evolutionary explanation may be required here. This is a list of some of the better known evolutionary theories on eating disorders, more or less in chronological order. One of the oldest theories is the reproductive suppression hypothesis. This has a number of different variants in the literature, which includes the parental manipulation theory, the reproductive suppression of subordinates, and there are others. Another theory is my own, which was published in 1998, the sexual competition hypothesis. There is the adapted to flee famine, the social threat hypothesis, the life history and executive functions model, the insurance hypothesis of Daniel Nettle. And this is basically a theory really to explain obesity, but it also is relevant to anorexia nervosa. And finally, the most recent is the extended mismatch model based upon the sexual competition hypothesis. Now, this is a somewhat busy table, which I'm not expecting you to digest at all, but I'll just pick out some themes here. This compares 7 evolutionary theories on eating disorders on 7 parameters, You will, I just want to point out some trends here. Evolutionary mismatch is implicated in 6 out of the 7 theories listed here. Female competition of various degrees is implicated in 5 out of the 7 theories. All 7 theories are relevant to anorexia nervosa. Only the sexual competition hypothesis and the extended mismatch are relevant to bulimia nervosa. Other eating disorders are not explained by the majority of these. Only 3 of these theories, including the sexual competition hypothesis, are relevant to explaining other eating disorders. The male variant of eating disorders, again, only the sexual competition and the extended mismatch are relevant to those. And only the reproductive suppression hypothesis and the sexual competition hypothesis have had have been supported by empirical evidence. So some of the evolutionary themes that arise from the epidemiological and other features, and also themes that arise from surveying the evolutionary theories on eating disorders, include evolutionary mismatch. This is a concept that those of you steeped in evolution will be familiar with. The issue of sexual selection, and specifically intrasexual competition, mainly female intrasexual competition, and also the phylogenetics of the human mating system. And I'll be touching upon each of these. So evolutionary mismatch, for the benefit of those of you who may be new to evolutionary medicine, this is also known as genome lag. And is one of the most important, and in my view, useful concepts in evolutionary medicine. It refers to the harm that novel environmental conditions can cause to health as a result of normally functioning systems becoming dysfunctional. We can expand on this if required in Q&A, but I'm going to leave it at that for the moment. But it's certainly an important aspect of most evolutionary theories are on eating disorders. So turning to sexual selection. Now, Charles Darwin, in his 1871 book, The Descent of Man, noted that some traits in organisms do not aid survival, and in fact may even hinder survival, and therefore they could not have arisen through natural selection. He proposed that these traits have arisen through sexual selection. That's to say, traits that improve fitness, improve reproductive success through increasing mating opportunities. That's to say, these traits are attractive to the opposite sex. The canonical example of a sexually selected traits is the peacock's tail. Now, the peacock's tail serves no survival advantage to the peacock. You can see that this peacock is struggling to keep airborne because of his extravagant and huge tail. But the tail has been this trait has led to successful mating opportunities because peahens find it attractive. Now, it is not the reason why sexually selected traits are attractive appears not to be a random phenomenon. They are markers of genetic quality that are costly and difficult to fake. This is sometimes referred to as the handicap principle. Now, sexually selected traits don't only apply, of course, to peacocks. They apply to all sexually reproducing organisms, including humans. And these have consequences. Some of these consequences create vulnerabilities to disorder. Now, some of the consequences of sexual selection is that in humans, that is that there are sex differences in humans that manifest both in morphological as well as in some psychological differences. It's important to note that the human lineage has evolved a distinct mating system that includes pair bonding, more of which to follow in a moment, which has given rise to the challenges of finding, attracting, and retaining long-term mates, so that males and females employ sex-specific strategies to compete with members of the same sex, and this can diverge in some of the qualities they desire in long-term mates. For instance, men tend to value youth more highly in long-term mates, whereas women value earning capacity more highly in long-term mates. This has been cross-culturally studied and found to apply widely among humans. So according to the sexual competition hypothesis, the female typical strategies for mate attraction and retention that emphasize physical attractiveness are central to the understanding of eating disorder. So to put the human mating system in its phylogenetic context, we note that one of the characteristics of humans, of the human mating system, is the phenomenon of pair bonding. This is the enduring affinity between two individuals, and in this case, two individuals of the opposite sex, which has reproductive consequences. Now, pair bonding exists in many species. It's not just in humans. However, importantly, in humans, this characteristic or trait seemed to have developed in the human lineage after separation from the last common ancestor with the chimpanzees. That's to say, we do not seem to have inherited this from our primate and great ape ancestors. So pair bonding is the basis for long-term mating strategies in humans, and also the universality of marriage, which is the public recognition of who has sexual access to whom. All of these have arisen, and this is a really crucial point in this story, that these have arisen within the human lineage and are absent in chimpanzees and bonobos, our closest ape relatives. Within this mating system, men are high paternal investors and provisioners of mate and offspring, and this is also absent in other primates and most mammals. So that within this system, a man's fitness became tied up to the number of fertile years of a woman he can monopolize, the number of fertile years remaining of any given female is referred to as reproductive potential. And within the system, a woman's fitness became tied up to her mate's provisioning effort. That's to say, his willingness and ability to provide material resources. And it's important to note here that visual cues are more effective at assessing a female's reproductive potential than it is to judge a man's reliability as a provider. And that's also an important factor in the dimorphism, the psychological dimorphism in humans. So that the nature of the exchange within the human mating, long-term mating system is that of paternal investment in return for paternity assurance. Again, this is entirely absent in chimpanzees and bonobos because paternity is completely obscured. It is unknown. These are the evolutionary roots of both the female competition for mates. This is in the term of long-term mating, and male choosiness. Now, the male choosiness doesn't really enter into the sexual competition hypothesis for eating disorders, but certainly female competition for mates does. So, having had this background, I'm now going to state the sexual competition hypothesis. So this states that eating disorders are manifestations of female intrasexual competition, whereby autonomous females of reproductive age compete intensely with each other in the novel environment of large cities through the display of signs of youth and nubility. And I'm going to discuss the concept of nubility and so forth in a moment, through a strategy of the pursuit of thinness. This leads to what I have termed runaway female intrasexual competition, the extreme version of which is eating disorder. So it's important to note here that within the sexual competition hypothesis, eating disorders are not considered to be adaptive, but they are a dysfunctional extreme of an adaptive trait. And the dysfunctional extreme occurs due to mismatch. So the sexual competition hypothesis is based on the idea that there is a mismatch, and this refers to evolutionary mismatch, between the design of the human female psychological adaptation for mate attraction and retention and for competing with rival females on the one hand and the modern human environment on the other. So the sexual selection, it is suggested that sexual selection has shaped both human morphology and mating psychology, so that sexual selection has led to the evolution of the female hourglass nubile shape that characterizes females at the peak of their reproductive potential, and also designed psychological adaptations that motivate women to attend to their physical appearance in order to display their mate value in competition with other females within their environment. So just to recap, the sexual competition hypothesis based on Darwinian theory of sexual selection, which has led to the evolution of the female nubile shape and the psychological drive to display visual cues of physical attractiveness, mainly signs of youth and good health, and that factors in the modern environment have intensified female intersexual competition. These include such things as high levels of female autonomy, socially imposed monogamy, declining fertility, living in large cities, and media images of hyper-attractive young females that are mistaken for competitors. So youth, it is important to note, has always been a major determinant of female reproductive potential. That's to say, female reproductive potential is strictly age dependent so it's age dependent in women. That's to say, with every passing year of a given female, that her reproductive potential reduces by that proportion of the total number of fertile years. This is much less evident in men, and therefore there's a little bit of interference there, but it's gone now. And visual cues of advancing age, that's to say, of the decline in reproductive potential, include weight gain. Certainly, that is the case in environments with abundant nutrition, and also a deterioration of the hourglass nubile figure, either due to weight gain or due to the repeated cycles of gestation and lactation, as occurs in traditional societies. And therefore, slimness is associated with youthfulness, and this is there is empirical evidence to support this. So, so turning now to the concept of waist to hip ratio, there appears to be a universal male preference for a particular female waist to hip ratio that provided, in the ancestral environment, that provided a visual signal for the female's reproductive potential, reproductive history, as well as current fertility. This is how it's measured, the waist to hip ratio. And these line drawings are how it's been studied worldwide. These line drawings were devised by an evolutionary psychologist at the University of Texas, Devendra Singh, and consist of 3 different weights, and for each weight, 4 different waist to hip ratios ranging from 0.7 to 1. Now, these line drawings have been now studied in cross-culturally in a large number of countries. One of the largest studies is that by Swami et al. 2010, who surveyed 7,500 subjects from 26 countries. Their main findings were that the vast majority of subjects showed a broadly similar body shape preferences, and that rural areas and lower socioeconomic status preferred individuals preferred relatively heavier bodies. Increased exposure to Western media predicted preference for thinner bodies, and females consistently misconstrued males as preferring thinner bodies than is the case. And herein lies a clue that this phenomenon is not only designed to attract members of the opposite sex, but it's also a competitive signal to rival females, as it seems that there is a propensity for women to overshoot the mark and go one step further, and thus at times to the detriment of the design of this trait. So I would suggest to you that the sexual competition hypothesis has the explanatory power to explain aspects of eating disorders which other theories are either only explain partially or not at all. And they include the questions: why are females particularly vulnerable? Why females of reproductive age? Why the particular geographical distribution of eating disorders? And why have eating disorders emerged or increased in recent times? Now, these were the predictions that I made in my original proposal in 1998. And they include the prediction that eating disorder patients will show a higher level of intrasexual competition compared to controls, that societies with high fertility will show lower rates of eating disorders, that increasing female autonomy in any given society will be associated with an increase in the rate of eating disorders, and that exclusive lesbians will have a lower risk of eating disorders, whereas exclusive male homosexuals will have a higher risk. Those in red are predictions that have been supported by evidence of studies. Okay, now I'm going to survey very briefly, some of the studies designed to test the sexual competition hypothesis. Most of the studies are studies of non-clinical populations with one small clinical study. So the first one was the Arizona study. This put forward the hypothesis that there were two types of intrasexual competition in females, one for mates, one for status, and that the competition for mates was more related to bulimia, whereas the or let's say bulimic behavior, given that this was a non-clinical study, and the competition for status was more relevant to anorexia. This was the characteristics of this population. It's mainly female undergraduates in an American university. And the measures used were three sets of measures. Some measures for competitiveness, a measure of abnormal eating behavior, and a measure of mate value, both of self and ideal partner. And the main conclusions and findings of that study was that both anorexic and bulimic behaviors, and remember this was a non-clinical study, were found to be ultimately driven by female intrasexual competition for mates. Although competition for status was indeed found to be more important in anorexic behaviors, this was found to be ultimately driven by female intrasexual competition for mates, and therefore this study supported the sexual competition hypothesis. This is a replication study in a UK population, again non-clinical study in Loughborough. It aimed at replication with an extension, and the extension was to add a life history strategy measure. I'm not going to say much about the concept of life history strategy, but if people want to raise issues in Q&A, then we can expand on that. So the idea or the reason why life history was added as a measure was to explain if intrasexual competition is driving eating disorders, why do some females become bulimics and others anorexic? So the hypothesis was that intrasexual competition was a common factor However, those with a fast life history strategy will be more vulnerable to bulimia, whereas those with a slow life history strategy would be vulnerable to anorexia, or let's say bulimic behavior and anorexic behavior, given this is a non-clinical population. These are the characteristics of the participants, very similar to the Arizona study. Again, female university students from the University of Loughborough. The summary findings of that study was that in a non-clinical population, abnormal eating attitudes and behaviors were predicted by intrasexual competition for mates and a fast life history strategy. Unfortunately, we were not able to compare the anorexic behavior and the bulimic behavior because we had so few anorexic behaviors and we had an abundance of bulimic behaviors. So we couldn't conduct the comparison. However, what we did find was that the higher scores on the abnormal eating behavior questionnaire was correlated significantly with fast life history strategy. And given that bulimic behavior was common, that supported the hypothesis that bulimia that in intersexual competition and fast life history strategy may be implicated in bulimia. We couldn't comment on the anorexia. This is another study by a different group at the University of Texas that used a different design. They used an abnormal eating behavior questionnaire which they administered to men and women, then primed them for competition cues, and then administered the questionnaire a second time. What they found was that men did not increase their scores on the abnormal eating questionnaire after being primed for competition, whereas women did. And in their second study, the study 2, they had 4 subgroups, and these were males and females, heterosexual, homosexual. So 4 groups. They did exactly the same design, administered the abnormal eating questionnaire, then primed them for competition and re-administered it. What they found was that heterosexual women and homosexual men increased their scores, whereas lesbian women and heterosexual men did not. And this supports the prediction made in my original 1998 article. Now, there has been recent, in the last 20 or 25 years, there has been descriptions of a new and male variant of eating disorder, whereby rather than feeling that their body is too large and they want it to become smaller or thinner, they actually, some boys and men feel that their upper body is too small, and they have a drive to or a desire to increase their muscle bulk of their upper body. And this has been referred to as a drive for muscularity, as opposed to a drive for thinness. So it seems that in contrast with females, males can suffer from 2 different variants of eating disorder. The female typical variant, which is the drive for thinness, and this seems to be this variant seems to affect, or where homosexual men seem to be more vulnerable to this variant, and remember that homosexual men are out to attract other men, and of course the men they want to attract have highly sensitive and highly tuned, are highly sensitive and tuned for visual cues of physical attractiveness, and therefore similar dynamics of intersexual competition apply to them as they may apply to females. So that would be one variant where intersexual competition or the sexual competition hypothesis can explain. And this new variant, which is the drive for muscularity, is the male, it seems, the male typical variant. And this can also be explained through the sexual competition hypothesis, given that that the evolutionary roots of male competition and male physical contests go back much deeper in evolutionary time than even the human lineage. It goes back to our primate and even our mammalian heritage, and there is a significant literature that suggests that physical contest had been important in in male intersexual competition within the human lineage, and therefore the sexual competition hypothesis is able to explain both of these variants in men. This is the small exploratory clinical study that was conducted in Germany. This compared 20 anorexics with 20 bulimics, and these were diagnosed patients with 29 age and sex match controls. The measures were very similar to the Loughborough study, which is measures of abnormal eating behavior, competition, life history, strategy, and also mate value. And the main findings of this study were that in the combined group of anorexia and bulimia, intersexual competition for mates was significantly predicted by severity of disordered eating, and that bulimia nervosa patients showed a significant increase in intersexual competition for mates compared to controls, but this was not the case for the anorexia nervosa group. And this is, of course, a problem for the sexual competition hypothesis. Bulimia nervosa patients had a fast life history strategy compared to both anorexia and controls. So this study partially supports the sexual competition hypothesis. Possible explanations for the anomalous findings: small sample size. This study was underpowered. Bulimia and anorexia nervosa may have distinct evolutionary roots. And also, the current classifications of eating disorders may not reflect the deep structure of these disorders. For example, anorexia nervosa restrictive type and anorexia nervosa binging, purging type may need to be analyzed separately. These are just ideas. So just a word about the extended mismatch hypothesis of eating disorders. Two groups, one from the UK, Aitin and Ibrahim, and another from Finland and Australia, have proposed an extension to the sexual competition hypothesis. These models consider that female competition is necessary but not sufficient, is a necessary but not sufficient cause of eating disorders. Aitin and Ibrahim consider nutritional mismatch to be the missing ingredient, especially the consumption of ultra processed foods. Rantala et al. Consider a plethora of mismatches, including nutrition, neuroinflammation, gut dysbiosis, stress hormones, and others. They propose that the modern environment produces a fundamental, what they call meta problem, causing the mechanisms of obtaining food and those concerned with mating to act in conflict with each other, unlike what occurred in the ancestral environment. In my view, the extended mismatch model is currently the state of the art in evolutionary explanations for eating disorder. So, what's the clinical utility of this research? Well, it's a novel theoretical approach to the investigation of the etiology of eating psychopathology. It has the potential for incorporation into clinical assessments of patients. It has the potential for incorporation into psychological therapy. An example of this, which is actually consistent with the sexual competition hypothesis, although not based on it, is the media literacy programs that have claimed some efficacy in the treatment of eating disorders. So, in conclusion, I would suggest that most extant, proximate, or non-evolutionary theories on eating disorders have poor explanatory and predictive value. That the sexual competition hypothesis has been supported by evidence from non-clinical populations and partially supported by one small clinical study to date. The sexual competition hypothesis has the potential for being used in the assessment and treatment of eating disorder patients. The extended mismatch theories or models for eating disorders is an extension or are an extension of the sexual competition hypothesis and claim to widen its explanatory scope to include, in addition to anorexia and bulimia, binge eating disorder, obesity, and a range of other conditions. And these have considerable face validity. And I would suggest that larger clinical studies of evolutionary theories on eating disorders are required both to test their predictions and to evaluate interventions that arise from them. Thank you very much. I hope you're still there.
Thank you, Riadh. Yes, we're all here listening attentively and really appreciate your talk. That was an excellent overview, so clear and comprehensive. And obviously the focus of your talk was on eating disorders, but you managed to cover huge territory in terms of evolutionary principles as applied to psychiatric disorders. For some reason, with all the talk of hyper attractive females and reproductive years, I was thinking of Naomi Campbell, who this week gave birth to a child at the age of 50. And so her image was in my mind as you were talking for some reason. But principles you've covered include, environmental mismatch, such a fundamental principle in evolutionary psychiatry, sexual selection, life history strategy, which you only touched on, but I think is a fascinating area in itself. And then a key principle as well, which you've highlighted, is that disorders are not in themselves adaptive. They generally represent perhaps adaptive strategies that have just gone into overdrive and become maladaptive and dysfunctional. So I'm going to go over this talk again, the recording, a number of times, because there's so much in it for people who are relatively immersed in the area like me, and for newbies as well. I might just kick off with one question, if that's okay. I think, like a lot of areas, I think the clinical implications tend to come down to oftentimes psychotherapy and psychotherapeutic implications for individuals and groups. And you've mentioned that in your conclusions. But I was wondering as well, would you say, for example, you had a meeting with the Minister for Health in the morning in the UK, do you think that the evolutionary perspective could have public health implications for, things like media exposure, advertising, the images that young people are exposed to. Do you think that we could inform public health strategies in any way from an evolutionary point of view?
It's an interesting point you raise, Henry, and the answer must be yes. Although I'm very, very reticent and cautious about simplistic, giving you a simplistic answer here to say, if we discourage certain types of images, or if we, because I don't believe that there is any silver bullet here that will be that will suddenly remove, let's say, the toxic effect of the media, because there's certain aspects of modern media that are not controllable, I think. But I think better public education about the harm that can happen. But I don't have any ready-made prescriptions to say if only we could do this or that. But certainly there are aspects. But I mean, it's not just modern media; it's the social media now, which is playing maybe a much larger role, and maybe a much more toxic, having a much more toxic effect on youngsters, with the scope for social comparison, which is entirely hidden from public view, but known to those who participate in the social media. Unlike mass media, which of course is open to all, and magazines or billboards or TV adverts and so forth. But the social media probably now is playing a far more harmful role in terms of promoting certain types of images, certain social comparisons, which may be intensifying intersexual competition in ways that we don't even fully understand yet. But I would suggest that, given the fact that this is not even part of the thinking of those in the public health sphere, or in amongst specialists within the eating disorder sphere, maybe a first step would be to consider the influence of or the significance of evolutionary ideas, and I would draw attention to the writings of some evolutionary psychologists who have actually tackled some of the areas of advertising and so forth. There's a guy from Canada, Gad Saad. I don't know whether you
Yes, I've heard. Yeah.
Heard his name. He's written some really excellent, maybe 2 or 3 books on the effect on the evolutionary psychology of advertising and the evolutionary psychology of media images, and how that can have an influence on people's behavior, so that an evolutionary angle can be helpful, I think, although I don't think I would be able to provide any ready-made suggestions to the minister.
Yeah. No, thank you, Riadh. That's really helpful. We might just keep you for another 1 or 2 questions, if that's okay, because I see there's lots coming through here.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to have a look at the chat here.
You might as well share your screen so that people will be able to.
Okay. Yes. I'll share content. Is it? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Actually, I'll just read out a few here. Jerry Rafferty has made the point: the ability to menstruate is dependent on BMI and a fixed percentage of stored body fat. This would seem to contradict that thinness is attractive. Okay, so Riadh, menstruation, BMI, percentage of stored body fat. Would you have any comments on that?
Well, I have I mean, I have mentioned that this adaptation works up to a point, but then comes a tipping point where it can become maladaptive. So on the whole, the pursuit of thinness taken within competing, let's say, within a given environment up to a point is definitely helpful to the majority of women. But it is unhelpful to a minority, and that is where the mismatch kicks in. So I agree that that thinness, some individuals overshoot the mark, and this becomes then self-damaging. So I don't disagree at all with that. I mean, that is definitely part of the hypothesis, where I'm not suggesting in any way that anorexia or bulimia are adaptive strategies. Yeah. I mean, adaptive conditions, not in themselves, but they arise from adaptations.
Exactly, and I think, and again, that's such an important principle. It comes up in lots of our discussions, whether it's mood disorders or psychosis, that there can be this misperception that these conditions are viewed as being adaptive in some way, but in most situations they represent overshoots or pathological manifestations of adaptive strategies.
And I think this is a core in the understanding of mismatch. Mismatch is not just about identifying a novel environment, it's also about understanding what psychological or biological system is being mismatched to that environment. So I hope that I have gone some way today to explaining what the system is, which is, it's really the system of long-term mating that is implicated here. And I've also tried to give, to put that system in phylogenetic context as well, because I think that is important when we start to be, when we start thinking about animal models.
Yes, yes.
I think we have Tom, who's got his hand up.
Okay, Tom. Helen, can you unmute Tom?
I think I'm unmuted now.
Great. Go ahead, Tom.
Your theory has been around for 20 years, and the extension of it, I think, is particularly interesting for two reasons. One, because it links it with problems of binge eating disorder and obesity as well. But secondly, in a way, it must be quite disappointing to have a theory around for 20 years and only 2 studies having been done to try to validate it. And I'm just wondering if the link to obesity, which is such a massive public health problem, far larger than the eating disorder problem, it may provide the potential for decent funding to try to understand these dynamics.
I agree fully. In fact, in our forthcoming volume, I've collaborated with Agnes Ayton on writing a chapter on eating disorders, and we've incorporated obesity as part of that chapter. As you say, it is obesity is now an epidemic across the Western world and beyond, and it's a real public health problem. on the issue of lack of testing, of lack of empirical research on my theory, it's not unusual actually for evolutionary theories to remain neglected, unfortunately. This actually applies to most evolutionary theories of depression. They just lie gathering dust in the literature. So it's just, there is a kind of a bit of resistance, I would say. There is a bit of a barrier between the mainstream physicians and psychiatrists and evolutionary theories of disease in general. But as you say, maybe with a massive public health problem like obesity, this might be an opportunity to maybe for this kind of thinking to receive the attention that it deserves.
Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe one more question.
Jerry?
Jerry, okay, Jerry, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for an excellent talk, by the way. It was really interesting. You know, there's an old kind of Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times, but given that very particularly the rise in eating disorders has been so significant during the pandemic and lockdown, has that given us a snapshot as to how eating disorders respond from an evolutionary point of view, that there's such a dramatic increase when societies change so dramatically?
I agree with what you said. Is there a question there?
Or why do you think eating disorders have particularly, of all psychological illnesses, been so elevated during the lockdown and the pandemic?
Oh, during the lockdown, I don't know is the answer, but I have noticed similar claims. I mean, I don't know that we have figures on this. Is it the social media? It could be. It could be that a lot of youngsters have been, you know, overusing social media, which involve social comparison, and that might be one explanation. But really, I don't know. I don't know the answer to this. I mean, there have been even claims that there has been an increase in male variants of eating disorders during the pandemic, and I don't. I mean, my only hunch is that social media is playing a role here.
Yeah, I mean, certainly anecdotally amongst CAMs in Ireland, there's been a 5-fold increase in referrals for eating disorders. I noticed Dr. Clifford is on the call, and she might be able to speak more to that.
Well, I'd be interested to know. Yeah, I haven't heard that it's as high as 5-fold. I mean, that would be really, really interesting to know that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Comment?
Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Jerry. And thank you, Riadh. Any comments from our eating disorder colleagues or any questions? Okay, so I think we could go on here for forever, Riadh. So I'm going to try and draw a close to it, but certainly I have. I'm so impressed by what you've done, and not just today, but over a number of years. And you've been a great source of encouragement and inspiration for us in our group in Ireland as well. I think the group should be aware just how privileged we are to have a speaker like you. I think along with Randy Nessy and Martin Brune, you've been international leading lights in this area. And I'd encourage people now here in Ireland, if you haven't already joined, but to join with the Royal College Evolutionary Psychiatry Special Interest Group as well. And to
absolutely, joining is free, and you'll get our newsletter and
Yes.
our newsletters and other notifications. So yeah, you're welcome.
And it's an excellent newsletter, and hopefully we can collaborate more. We might even look at putting together a brief article for your newsletter on our experience of setting up a special interest group here and send it on to you.
That's an excellent idea. Please do, Henry. Please do.
Yeah. So so that's it. So we'll say goodbye and thank you, Gurav Mila Mahagat in Irish, and hope to see you maybe in the flesh, in reality, in October.
Yes, well,
you never know.
Hopefully, if the world comes back to normal, then we can all meet face to face. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Riadh.